It was a calm Monday morning in Kansas City, September 28, 1953. The kind of morning where sidewalks were still damp from overnight rain, traffic eased down Ward Parkway, and the bells of Notre Dame de Sion School echoed softly as 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease adjusted the strap on his satchel and walked into class like he did every day. He was too young to know the weight his last smile carried, too young to sense that history had just turned its cruel gaze on him. Because at precisely 10:55 a.m., a woman in a green dress knocked on the school's front door, claimed to be his aunt, and whispered a lie so convincing it changed everything. She said Bobby's mother had collapsed from a heart attack and was at St. Mary's Hospital. Her voice cracked at just the right beat. She fumbled with her purse like a worried relative, and the nun who answered, Sister Morand, believed her. Without a second thought, she called little Bobby from his class. He emerged with innocent eyes, clutching a small, polished Jerusalem medal around his neck, the same one his parents had given him to remind him he was loved and protected by his faith. He looked up at the woman, took her hand, and walked with her to a waiting taxi. He didn't hesitate. Why would he? In his world, strangers weren't predators. His family was wealthy, yes, but his life was sheltered, safe. Until that moment. What happened next unraveled one of the darkest tales in American criminal history, because Bobby never made it to the hospital. He never made it home. He didn't even make it to sundown. The woman, Bonnie Heady, and her partner, Carl Hall, had no intention of returning him. Within hours, Carl had taken the boy to a remote field outside Kansas City, sat him in the back seat of a Plymouth station wagon, pressed a .38 caliber revolver to his head, and pulled the trigger. Just like that. No second thoughts, no last words. A single brutal act that extinguished a young life before the ransom was even mailed. They wrapped Bobby's body in a tarp, drove 45 miles north to St. Joseph, Missouri, and buried him in a hastily dug grave beneath a backyard trellis. His hands folded over his chest, the plastic bag over his head still in place. But to the outside world, Bobby was still alive. That was the deception, and it was masterful. That same night, the first ransom letter arrived at the Greenlease mansion, carefully worded, postmarked from Kansas City, demanding $600,000 in small bills for Bobby's safe return. Robert Greenlease Sr., a self-made Cadillac tycoon worth over $10 million, held the letter in trembling hands. He was a man who had clawed his way up from nothing and now stared helplessly at the price tag on his son's life. His wife, Virginia, tried to stay composed as she cradled Bobby's pillow, waiting by the phone for a voice that would never call. Over the next 6 days, a series of cold, calculated letters followed. Each one came with updates, promises that Bobby was homesick but safe. One included the boy's Jerusalem medal, a sick token meant to reassure the parents that their son was still breathing. But Bobby had already been buried for days. Bonnie Heady, still drunk from bourbon and her own delusions, helped Hall write those letters. They studied the news and adjusted their language accordingly. Meanwhile, Hall called the Greenlease home 15 times, manipulating their hope, stringing them along like puppets dancing to grief. And the FBI, they were watching, but not fast enough. On October 4th, under the weight of desperation, the Greenleases delivered the ransom, $600,000 in $10 and $20 bills. It was the largest ransom payout in American history at the time. Robert Sr. did what any father would do. He paid, believing the lives of children are priceless. But Hall and Heady never intended to return Bobby. They collected the duffel bag from a prearranged drop site, drove out of Kansas City with $500,000 in their trunk, and laughed about their success. At least Hall did. Bonnie was growing unstable, mumbling prayers, drinking constantly, already haunted by the weight of Bobby's ghost. They fled to St. Louis, 380 miles east, checked into a seedy hotel, and Hall immediately began laundering the money. He stuffed the bills into 2 large metal suitcases, dumped the duffel bag into an incinerator, and changed motels 3 times in 2 days. The Coral Courts, the townhouse, the Normandy. He paid in cash, always in cash, and always drunk. Heady, left alone in a filthy Arsenal Street apartment, had no idea that Hall was preparing to abandon her. She sat in silence, rocking back and forth, clutching a single photograph of Bobby Greenlease and whispering nonsense to the boy she had helped murder. But fate has its way of circling back, and it did on October 6th, when a St. Louis cab driver named John Oliver Hager contacted police. He'd given Hall a ride and noticed the thick wad of bills he pulled from his coat. It didn't seem right. Something about the man felt wrong. St. Louis police traced him to the Townhouse Hotel. At 8 p.m., officers Louis Ira Shoulders and Elmer Dolan stormed the room. Hall surrendered instantly, not a shot fired. They found $300,000 neatly stacked in the metal suitcases. Hall looked up and muttered, "It's all there." But it wasn't. And that detail would become one of the great scandals of the case. Within hours, Hall gave up Bonnie Heady. She was arrested without resistance, too drunk to understand. They both confessed, Hall sobbing into his whiskey-soaked collar. But their stories didn't match. At first, Hall blamed a phantom accomplice named Tom Marsh, claiming he was the killer. But when FBI agents laid out the bloodstained seat cushions and the .38 caliber shell casings found at Heady's home, the truth came crashing down. Hall admitted he had pulled the trigger. Heady admitted she had watched. Together, they had dug the grave and lied to a nation. On October 7th, the FBI recovered Bobby's body, buried in Bonnie's backyard beneath a rusted trellis. The autopsy confirmed a single gunshot wound to the head. He was still wearing his school clothes, still had dirt under his nails, still clutched the tiny Jerusalem medal that meant everything to his parents. The green leases collapsed. Virginia fainted. Robert Sr., once one of the most composed businessmen in the Midwest, could no longer speak to reporters without shaking. Their only child was dead. Not for revenge, not for ideology, for money. But the case wasn't done, not by a long shot, because only half of the ransom was recovered. $300,000 vanished. Carl Hall swore it had been seized at the time of his arrest. Shoulders and Dolan, the 2 officers who had booked him, denied ever seeing the full amount. The FBI suspected something darker, that the officers had stolen half the ransom and covered it up. For years, investigations swirled, grand juries convened. In 1955, both men were convicted of perjury, but the money was never found. Some say it was buried in a field outside St. Louis. Others claim it was laundered and spent, but no one knows for sure. And that mystery, like Bobby's stolen life, remains a wound that never closed. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because what happened next, in the courtroom, in the gas chamber, and in the aftermath, would show the world that justice isn't always about closure. It's about reckoning with the kind of darkness that hides in broad daylight. When the full scale of the horror settled in, America was already watching with bated breath. The abduction, the betrayal, the brutal murder of a 6-year-old child, and now, the damning confession. Carl Hall and Bonnie Heady had played a nation, pulled heartstrings with forged letters and false hope, and walked away with blood on their hands and $600,000 in ransom, half of which had simply vanished. The press couldn't look away, neither could the public. Newsreels looped Bobby's school photograph on cinema screens. Journalists camped outside the courthouse. Everyone was asking the same question. What punishment could ever match the cruelty of what they had done? The courtroom was packed on October 30th, 1953. A somber silence filled the air as Carl Austin Hall and Bonnie Emily Heady entered, shackled and expressionless. The walls trembled with outrage, and not just from the press. It came from mothers, fathers, teachers, and ordinary Americans who couldn't fathom how someone could murder a child not out of rage, not out of impulse, but as part of a plan. They pleaded guilty, sparing the Greenlease family the agony of a full trial. But this wasn't mercy. It was strategy. They believed they might avoid the death penalty by accepting guilt. But the court wasn't interested in bargains. Judge Albert L. Reeves delivered the sentence without hesitation. Death in Missouri's gas chamber. He called it the most cold-blooded, calculated murder he had ever seen. 68 minutes of deliberation. That's all it took for the jury to seal their fate. December 18th, 1953. Just weeks after their arrest, Hall and Heady were transported to the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. In the early hours of the morning, they were strapped into metal chairs in the gas chamber, side by side, barely inches apart. The crowd outside the prison gates swelled. The public had been promised swift justice, and the government delivered. At 12:12 a.m., the cyanide pellets dropped. Carl Hall clenched his fists. Bonnie Heady never opened her eyes. 20 seconds later, they were both gone. Their execution remains one of the fastest in U.S. history post-conviction, less than 90 days from arrest to death. The nation exhaled. Justice, in the eyes of many, had been served. But for the Greenlease family, there was no justice. Only silence where laughter once lived. After the executions, the attention turned again to the missing money. Half the ransom had never been found. Hall insisted it was in the suitcases seized at the time of his arrest. Yet only $300,000 had been logged. Lieutenant Louis Ira Shoulders and Patrolman Elmer Dolan, St. Louis officers who had arrested Hall, were suddenly in the spotlight. Their statements conflicted, their reports inconsistent. The FBI grew suspicious. Whispers of corruption turned into formal accusations. Federal grand juries were summoned. In 1955, both men were convicted of perjury, though theft charges were never formally pursued. Dolan was later pardoned in 1965. The fate of the money remains unknown to this day. Some believe it was split among crooked cops. Others claim Hall had hidden it in a St. Louis field before his arrest. But no credible lead ever cracked that mystery. That part of Bobby's story, like so much else, remains buried in silence. The Greenlease family withdrew from the public eye. They never spoke publicly about the trial. They never attended the execution. Robert Sr., once a titan of Midwest business, aged overnight. He died in 1969. Virginia Greenlease lived until 2001, fading slowly into quiet obscurity. They left behind no other children, only memories of Bobby and a grief that never healed. In time, they created the Greenlease Foundation, a quiet philanthropic effort focused on helping Kansas City's youth. Perhaps it was a way to honor their son's stolen future. Perhaps it was the only way to keep breathing in a world that had taken everything from them. But the legacy of the case didn't fade. The 1953 kidnapping changed how America viewed trust. It shattered the illusion of safety that many parents held during the post-war years. Schools implemented strict identification policies. Visitors were no longer welcomed without checks. Locked doors became standard. The case was a catalyst for nationwide change in how child safety was handled. It was no longer enough to believe someone's story. The nation had learned through pain that deception could come in the shape of a grieving woman with trembling hands and a soft voice. The FBI, having recovered only half the ransom, doubled down on policy. Kidnapping response protocols were refined. Communication between state and federal agencies became faster. Training was updated. The Greenlease tragedy became a case study. First at Quantico, later at police academies across the country. Young agents read the files, memorized the timeline, studied the manipulation, the lies, the fatal gaps in judgment that allowed two sociopaths to steal a child from a Catholic school in broad daylight without resistance. Bobby Greenlease, became a ghost in the manuals. His smile frozen in the pages that warned future officers what could happen when procedures failed. And yet, the world never let go. Books were written, articles published. In 2009, John Heidenreich's Zero at the Bone reignited national interest. In 2013, the Kansas City Star ran a commemorative series marking 60 years since the kidnapping. Online forums debated the details, Reddit threads dissected the perjury charges, theorized about the missing cash, and mourned the senselessness of it all. To this day, some believe more people were involved, that the plan was too intricate, too cold for just two drunks to mastermind alone. Others argue the simplicity of the crime was what made it so horrifying. No syndicate, no conspiracy, just greed, pure and unfiltered, turning two broken souls into murderers. Bobby Greenlease, the boy at the heart of it all, would have turned 78 in 2025. The world he never saw has changed beyond recognition, technology, culture, law enforcement, but his story remains fixed in time. It's preserved in newspaper archives and court documents, but also in something more visceral, the collective American memory. He is remembered not just as a victim, but as a reminder of the fragility of innocence. That sometimes the monsters don't break in through windows. They knock politely on the front door and smile. The final haunting note is that the most unforgettable part of this case isn't even the money, or the executions, or the arrests. It's the moment the door opened at that school and a boy walked willingly into the arms of his killers. Trust, in its purest form, betrayed. And for that, no court, no verdict, no sentence can ever make the world right again. So now, as the years stretch on and new crimes fill the headlines, the name Bobby Greenlease still echoes. Quiet, steady, unforgettable. A whisper of warning in every crowded school, a shadow behind every ransom case. His Jerusalem medal, once a promise of protection, now sits in a drawer, tarnished but sacred. A relic of a life interrupted. And in Kansas City, the sun still rises over Notre Dame de Sion. Children still walk through those same doors, but the ghosts never left. They linger in the halls, in the walls, in the city's bones. Because some tragedies aren't just written into history, they re-etched into the soul of a place. And this one, this heartbreak, this quiet little story of one boy and two killers will never stop reminding us what it means to lose everything.